What is the function of the Remembrance Day service? Yes, it is to remember the fallen of the Great War and all the wars since. But it's also a time to remember those who have been left behind. As Baptists, we do not pray for those who have died. We pray for those who are left behind. We hope and pray that those amongst us that are left will know that those who have gone before are free of all the cares of the world, are free of pain, of anguish, and of doubt. We hope and pray that they will go to glory. But what of those left behind? They need consolation. Their grief is real. What about those who have been displaced by the tides of war? People whose homes have been destroyed. People whose crops and livelihoods have been destroyed. People who have had to flee from the familiar, from all that they have known, to escape whatever the soldiers may be doing. That, to my mind, is what Remembrance Sunday is about. Every side in every war says God is on our side. During the Great War, German troops went into battle with a belt buckle that said Gott mit uns, which means God is with us. Allied troops were equally convinced. God with us is in fact the official motto of the US government. It has been for some time, but it was officially taken up by Act of Congress in 1956. It's on the money. 1956, am I alone in thinking that's just before the Vietnam War started? We need to remember that the casualties of war exist not only for the combatants. In the Great War, 9 to 11 million soldiers, sailors and airmen perished. Estimates for civilian casualties are not so clear. They are 6 to 13 million. In the Second World War, 20 million soldiers, sailors and airmen were killed. Over 40 million civilians were killed. In all of these conflicts throughout history, from Greek and Roman times, the biggest killers has not been the sword, the spear, the arrow, or even in latter times, the machine gun, the artillery, the mortar. The biggest killer has always been disease and starvation, which always impact the civilian population greatest. In the early 1980s, I was in Bressuire, which is in central France. I spoke then to an elderly gentleman who had served in the First World War out of Verdun. I dare say that most of you will know the name of Verdun, where the French and the Germans bled each other dry. He talked of marching into the line in his battalion. That would have been 1,000 men. And a week later, they marched out of the line, 100 strong. You may ask, if war is so awful, why does it happen? Well, there are a number of reasons for that. I think chief amongst them is that young men think they're invulnerable. They really do. You don't have to have wars to see that. We see young men especially, and some young women these days, but young men especially, doing really silly, dangerous things all the time. You only have to go out on the road and watch them driving. And we all know, I mean from personal experience, that young men don't have to go to war to do foolish things that sadly end their lives. Of course, it's young men that fight wars and older men from behind the lines that direct them. That feeling of invulnerability lasts until a bullet zips past your ear with a nasty crack that makes you realise that ducking is no good because it's already gone past before you knew it was there. It lasts until a friend dies. It lasts until you personally are shot or hit by shrapnel or whatever. Saddest of all, of course, it lasts entirely through a young man's life if that shot or shrapnel or whatever killed him. As a boy, I was fascinated by war stories. Of course I was. I was a child of the 50s. We had war stories in comics. We had all of those great black and white films on the TV. The Great Escape. Oh, that wasn't a black and white one, that was a colour one, wasn't it? But, you know, The Wooden Horse, Ice Cold in Alex, all of those. And, of course, at that time, it was, the Second World War, still a recent memory. And there were still great war veterans around. There were other reminders, of course. One of my grandfathers was gassed in the Great War. He never properly recovered, and it did for him in the end, although he suffered for many years before it finally took him off. There are reminders still about then, you know, unexploded bombs. Second World War ordnance is still uncovered even today. First World War ordnance still kills people around the big battlefields like the Somme, because a lot of it didn't go off, and then some poor farmer ploughs it up, and then it does go off. 80, 90, 100 years later. There were still bomb sites when I was a little boy. And do you remember those buildings which either had big balks of timber outside, or they had a big metal plate, maybe two of them, on an outside wall where the whole building had been stapled through and the big metal plates on the outside stopped the outer walls from falling down. My grandmother and my aunt lived in a Victorian terrace. In fact, they lived in an end of terrace, which wasn't an end of terrace when it was built, because a couple of buildings weren't there anymore. They'd been bombed. And they had that big staple affair on the side of their building, stopping the outside wall from falling out. And you could still trace on the outside of their building where the rooms had been. And there were even little fragments of wallpaper, paint on them. So there were plenty of reminders. And as a boy, I thought that was ever so exciting. I listened avidly to my father's war stories. He didn't go on and on about it, but he did have a few stories. And some of them were very amusing. His stories about making a rocket. Well, the Germans had started making the V1 rocket, and later the V2, and my father and some of his comrades, my father being an armourer, decided that if the Germans could make a rocket, they'd make a rocket. So they got a tube of some sort of pipe and stuffed it with cordite taken out of shells, sealed the end, set it off it went with a whoosh, and a little while later the commanding officer of the air station came round and gave everyone a wigging because it had come down through some farmer's roof 3 or 4 miles away. Of course, nobody admitted they had anything to do with it. There was Rex the dog. Remember, this is a French squadron who thought they were being terribly Republican and cocking a snoot at the king by calling the dog Rex, only to find out afterwards that there are many, many dogs in England called Rex. It's a common name. And amusing, somewhat amusing in retrospect, he had a picture of his air crew, the air crew that he was with at the end of the war, posing in front of their Halifax bomber. And they're in their flight suits, and he points to a man on the end who is holding a parachute, and he says he never went up, he never volunteered, he wouldn't go, but he wanted to be in the photograph. So he said to one of the chaps, I'll hold that for you. So it looked as if he was part of the crew. Some of the stories gave you pause for thought. Training was done, and my father was in charge of air gunner training, in a turret, a bolt and pull turret that had been taken off a Halifax bomber, or maybe it was a spare, and mounted on the ground with the quad Browning machine guns in it. And you had a joystick. And if you pulled it backwards and forwards, the guns elevated and depressed. And if you put it to one side or the other, the turret rotated, so they could practice their air gunning. And you were practicing with live ammunition. Unfortunately, no one had thought about putting stops on the turret. Because, of course, in the aircraft, you can only go so far, and then you can't go any further because the aircraft's in the way. But this could go all the way round. And one chap got in there, got set up, got ready to go, and was so overcome by the machine gun, you had a button on the top of the joystick, and he's going, and his arm goes over, and the turret came all the way round, and he machine gunned the aerodrome. And everybody was diving to the ground, and as soon as it had gone overhead, they rushed in and pulled him out. He didn't become an air gunner. I mean, that is amusing, but it gives you some thought about, you know, that would be friendly fire and a half, wouldn't it? And then there are other stories that I lapped up as a boy, but gave me pause for thought later. For most of the war, my father was not allowed to go on flight duties. He was a master armourer. He and one other man translated all of the technical manuals for the aircraft. The Halifax bomber, of course, was made by the British. So all the manuals for the actual Halifax, for the bomb sites, for the ammunition and the guns, and for the bombs, were all translated from very technical English into very technical French. And that was my father's job. But towards the end of the war, the casualty rate had been so high, they were desperate for people, and he was allowed to fly. And he flew as Tail End Charlie, the tail gunner. Right at the end of the war, they were making daylight flights, not nighttime flights, daylight flights. And I can remember him saying that they flew over Hamburg, and he said it looked like the face of the moon. That's the civilian impact, isn't it? He recalled they came back from one flight over Germany. The aircraft Halifax had been attacked by a night fighter, and it strafed the aircraft, but the Halifax and the Lancaster were both very, very strong aircraft and could take an awful lot of punishment. So it got back, it landed, and the crew were hustled out. The top turret gunner was dead, and they weren't allowed to see him because it would affect morale, so he was hustled away. And I remember my father saying, he was only 19. Now when you're 10, 19 sounds ancient, doesn't it? When you get a bit older, you can understand what my father was saying. He was only 19. Towards the end of the war, and again this would have been on a daytime fight, the Halifax had dropped its bombs and was returning to the airbase, which at that time would have been Bordeaux-Mérignac, when they came across a Ju-52. That's a German transport aircraft. It's the one that looks like it's got the sides made from corrugated iron from old shed roofs. Very square thing, 3 engine. Now it can't get away. The Halifax Big 4 engine bomber, especially when it's dropped its bomb load, is much faster than this transport. And the pilot flew around the transport, flew circles around it. And my father remembers, my father said, at every one of the little portholes, there was a face with a German cap on it, and it was chalk white. Because of course the air gunners are following this transport with their turret guns. 4 machine guns in each turret. And they could see the Croix de Lorraine on the side of the aircraft. So they knew it was French. No love lost there, eh? But the pilot said, si on n'est pas armé, on ne tire pas. If it's not armed, you do not shoot. Must have been the last gentleman pilot left in France. But they didn't shoot, they let it go on its way. They say there are no atheists left in foxholes. And we can only speculate what that experience did for the Germans, who were undoubtedly fleeing Hitler's Germany, probably going to Switzerland or somewhere. What effect that had on the rest of their lives. If I can take